Mouse holes? I don't get it. Blowing up mouse holes. But how does that help? They're too small. Not actual mouse holes. Human holes, but called mouse holes. Human holes, but called mouse holes. Just send me a picture. Yeah, okay. December 24th, 1943. So it's been called off. Yep, the plan you really wanted to set in motion to defeat the enemy has been called off. Everyone says it can't be done. There isn't the time, there isn't the equipment necessary. Called off. So what do? Well, if you are Winston Churchill, you just call it back on. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, there were heavy Soviet attacks against Army Group Center with mixed results. In the South Seas, the Americans landed men on New Britain, and in Italy, continued attacks in the West finally took San Pietro. But in the East, the Moro River Campaign did not come close to achieving its goals. But 8th Army is attacking again this week. North of San Leonardo, the Canadians are still trying to take the Gully. They try a massive creeping barrage the 18th, but it fails. On the 20th, they try another one, and this time meet nearly no resistance at all. The Germans have evacuated the Gully to make instead a strong defense of Ortona. Ortona had been spared razing because of a wan hope in Montgomery's headquarters that it would fall quickly to become an Allied port and winter hostel for weary troops. That fantasy vanished in a great war at dawn on Tuesday, December 21st, when German demolitionists blew up a watchtower adjacent to the cathedral, leaving St. Thomas's dome split in half like a butchered deer. The 1st Canadian Infantry enters Ortona the 21st, and there is brutal house-to-house fighting there for the rest of the week. The side streets are too narrow for tanks, and the Germans are blowing up buildings to block intersections and hiding anti-tank guns in rubble and alleys. In Ortona, the Canadians became, among Allied soldiers, the acknowledged masters of house-to-house fighting. When the Germans dynamited buildings to block the streets with mountains of debris, the Canadians used field pieces to blast the crests off rubble so that tanks could climb over it. In solidly built-up blocks, where enemy snipers and machine gunners picked off every man who ventured into the streets, the Canadians advanced by mouseholing. They climbed to an upper floor in the first house in a block and attached a delayed action explosive charge to the wall that separated it from the adjoining house. Then they retired downstairs, waited for a charge to blow a hole through the wall, and rushed back to storm through the still smoking breach. They repeat the process until they have mouse-holed through an entire block. A big point here. I would say maybe masters among the Western allies of house-to-house fighting, because you gotta give a big nod to the Soviet defenders at Stalingrad for that too. Anyhow, on the 22nd, the 19th Indian Brigade attacks Villa Grande, but makes little headway, though they do better the 23rd and today. They will in fact clear Villa Grande of the enemy by the 26th. On the 23rd, 13th Corps tries another offensive against Orsonia, but the British and the New Zealanders make little headway against the 26th Panzer Division. New Zealand Commander Bernard Freyberg reportedly says, "It is not a question of further advance. It is a question of holding what we've got." So they go over to an active defense as the week ends. As for 5th Army in the west of Italy, although they took San Pietro last week, and although they have reinforcements now to make up for the heavy casualties, that's the 2nd Moroccan and 3rd Algerian divisions, Mark Clark realizes that his troops are just too far from Rome, near where an amphibious attack is scheduled to happen, as I talked about a couple weeks ago, to be able to link up with them should they land. So now on the 18th, he recommends that landing be canceled. Army Group Commander Harold Alexander agrees with him, and that is the end of the prospect of a quick capture of Rome. Makes sense. I mean, this offensive has been underway for half a month, and they haven't even closed in on the main German defense at Monte Cassino. And all the landing craft for such a landing are scheduled to go to Britain January 15th anyhow. However, there is one guy who who's not happy with calling off the amphibious landing, and that man is Winston Churchill. Remember, he's been sick in Tunis with pneumonia and is still bedridden all week until today, and he is determined that this Italian campaign not become a stalemate. It's a real baby of his, and as we know, he wants the action to be massively increased both here and in the Balkans. He's been lying in bed all this time making plans and ideas and cabling his chiefs of staff that the stagnation on the Italian front is scandalous and that they haven't used any combat shipping there since Salerno, and that was 3 months ago. Today, on Christmas Eve, he leaves his sickbed and joins Alexander and some other senior British officers for dinner, and they sit until midnight and agree they must make an amphibious assault in Italy. And the best looking beaches for this are southwest of Rome, near a resort town called Anzio. They really, really want to get this front going. I mean, except for Italy and Burma, the Allies are on the move. Like, 175 German divisions are withdrawing on the Eastern Front. There is Allied success after success in the South Seas and the Central Pacific, but not in Italy. Since Salerno, the US forces here have lost over 10% of their combat strength, and the British 18%. German command writes with satisfaction that the Allied advance on Rome is 10 kilometers a month. Thing is, it's not just in Italy. The Allies are generally stuck in the Mediterranean. Rick Atkinson points out that there are 25 divisions and 5,000 combat planes in this theater with no shipping or prospect of moving them elsewhere. British ports are overburdened as it is with all the Americans coming over. They can't handle a flood from the Mediterranean as well. Okay, it's not exactly a rosier picture for the Germans. They have like 300,000 men here. 23 divisions stuck. Joseph Goebbels thinks just throwing 15 or so over to the Eastern Front would stop the Soviet advance, but they can't. Well, beginning today, there is a series of announcements that shake up the Allied leadership around Europe. Now, I'll get to all that next week, for there is a lot more field action to cover today. On the 24th, a task force of cruisers and destroyers bombards Buka Island and Buin on Bougainville. This is to divert attention from coming landings on New Britain. There is some action on Bougainville itself this week. The Japanese have been shelling the Allied airfields around their beachhead at Cape Torquemada from the northeast. So on the 18th, the American Marines take what they call Hell's a Poppin' Ridge after a week of fighting. The most important factor in its capture, according to the Marines, was one of the first instances of close air support in the Pacific War. Guided by a ground controller with a radio from a damaged Marine aircraft, Marine dive bombers were able to deliver their ordnance within 75 yards of the Marines on the ridge. This is important since the Japanese have been using the reverse slope to hide from artillery and aerial attacks. The Marines also take Hill 600A, today the 24th. So they have neutralized the Japanese artillery there, and a stalemate sets in, though the Marines are about to be relieved. The 37th and Americal divisions from 14th Corps begin arriving tomorrow and will all be in place by mid-January. There are also 3 more air raids on Rabaul from the Torquemada airfield this week, and the war of attrition I mentioned last week is in full swing. Though both sides lose roughly even numbers of planes this week, the Japanese cannot make up the replacement numbers, and the Allies can. Of course, the fighting in the USSR is always a war of attrition. The Vitebsk-Gorodok offensive by Ivan Bagramian's First Baltic Front and the Western Front continues there this week. Gorodok, in fact, falls to the Soviets today on the 24th. While this is happening, 43rd and 39th Armies on 1st Baltic's left wing are attacking 3rd Panzer Army east of Vitebsk pretty much all week long as covering attacks. Southeast of Vitebsk, 1st Baltic's 39th Army and Western Front's 33rd attack the 23rd. This is the first part of a 2-prong attack, with the other prong scheduled to go off tomorrow. I mentioned last week that Konstantin Rokossovsky's Belarusian front wants to maintain the gap that they hold between German 2nd and 9th armies, right? Well, that does not go his way this week, as the Germans have reorganized and they attack big style the 20th, breaking the whole defensive front, advancing everywhere, and with spearheads from the two armies linking up the 21st. The next 3 days, the advances continue, and by now, some Soviet units are threatened with encirclement. As for German attacks in the USSR, Hermann Balck's attack against the Irscha River line, supposed to go off last week, goes off now on the 18th. SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, backed by elements of the 1st Panzer Division, force a crossing west of Melanie. 7th Panzers force their own, but they face tougher resistance and make little progress over the rest of the week. And, as Prit Buttar puts it, an increasingly pointless battle of attrition died slowly down. You know what? Here's a bigger quote from Buttar about the bigger picture in the region. Manstein had placed great hope in a counterattack with the relatively fresh divisions that had been assigned to him. The narrative adopted by the Germans was that their counterattacks prevented the Red Army from bursting through the northern flank of 4th Panzer Army and turning southwest, an advance that would have been catastrophic for Manstein's army group. The Soviet version of events was that their attacks resulted in the recapture of Kiev, and whilst the failure to hold Zhytomyr was a bitter disappointment, the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions were drawn into fighting that cost them heavy casualties. Also, Balck has some serious complaints about what he calls the misuse of his armored reinforcements, creating the 25th Panzer Division and then throwing it into the lines before the men have properly trained as a unit. He thinks this was just a huge waste. But guess what? He does not have much time to reflect on that. Today, on the 24th, as the week ends, Nikolai Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front kicks off a massive assault to retake ground west of Kiev. He's been reinforced, and 4th Panzer Army cannot hold him back. It looks like he will make a deep penetration. See, the forces that Balck has been attacking have actually been part of a Soviet concentration of force going on since late November. Georgy Zhukov and Joseph Stalin have had Vatutin preparing this offensive designed to throw the enemy here back to the Bug River so that a bunch of armies have gathered here for the assault. Just Mikhail Katukov's well-rested 1st Guards Tank Army alone has like 600 tanks and self-propelled guns, which is more than the combined force of all the panzer divisions in the whole sector. Today, on Christmas Eve, Kirill Moskalenko's 38th Army artillery blasts the beginning of the attack, and when the army gets rolling, it advances at 1 or 2 miles per hour. They reach the outskirts of Brusilov as darkness falls. Christmas will soon be upon them all, but the town will fall to the Soviets before the dawn. And in the far south of the Eastern Front, Fyodor Tolbukhin's 4th Ukrainian Front attacks again this week towards the Nikopol bridgehead. On the 19th, they advanced towards Dniprovka, but counterattacks late the evening of the 20th restore the lines. So, the Soviets have big winter plans. Basically, offensives along the entire line. There are 4 main actions to destroy the enemy near Leningrad, in Belarusia, Western Ukraine, and the Crimea, though the main attack is to be in the southwest to take back all of the industrial and natural resources currently in German hands there. This would also likely most quickly bring the Red Army back to the 1941 borders. John Erickson gives some numbers in The Road to Berlin about the Soviet enemy's strength. Over 60% of the total Wehrmacht strength and over 50% of its armor is on the Eastern Front. 236 divisions for 4,906,000 men. Of that, 706,000 from Germany's allies. 5,400 tanks and assault guns, 54,000 big guns and mortars, and 3,000 planes. What the Soviets have here is 5,568,000 men with the field armies and nearly 500,000 in reserve. These are in 480 divisions that run 6,000 to 7,000 men each, 35 armor and mechanized corps, 46 tank brigades, and 80 artillery and mortar divisions, 5,628 tanks, 8,818 planes. They do also have tanks and planes aplenty in reserve. People have asked me about the Red Army before, and here's about how it is currently structured, okay? 3 rifle regiments made up a rifle division. Between 2 and 4 rifle divisions, a rifle corps. The basic tactical unit in the armored forces was the tank brigade, with a shade over 1,000 men and 3 tank battalions, 21 tanks to a battalion. The tanks corps consisted of 3 tank brigades, the mechanized corps of 3 mechanized brigade. This brigade consisting of 3 motorized rifle battalions with tank, artillery, and mortar support, and a tank brigade. It was in artillery, however, that the Red Army showed its enormous power. I have mentioned in the past Soviet Artillery Marshal Nikolai Voronov and his reorganization of the Soviet artillery. By now, it is very much concentrated, meaning that a rifle division's artillery is just a few dozen mortars and big guns maybe, but there are loads of dedicated artillery regiments, divisions, and corps, and an artillery division has like 200 heavy guns and howitzers, backed by 100 or so heavy mortars. Well, we shall see soon enough how these attacks all go off. But this week of the war has reached its end. With close quarters fighting in Italy, an impending breakthrough in Ukraine, close air support in Bougainville, and Churchill with a bee in his bonnet about a place called Anzio. Successful Red Army attacks in the southwest would, in addition to what I said earlier, set them up for a future advance either through Romania to the Balkans or up into Poland to hit Army Group Center in their rear or their flanks. Big front, big plans. Autumn has officially given way to winter this week, and this is how that front currently looks, where Joseph Stalin has 58 armies poised on the front lines. From the Barents Sea to the Gulf of Finland, the line runs west of Murmansk and through Belomorsk down to Lake Ladoga. This has been static for over 2 years, but the 4 armies of the Soviet Karelian front stand ready, and one from the Leningrad front holds the Karelian Isthmus. Then from the Gulf of Finland, south of Leningrad, east of Chodov and Staraya Russa, west of Veliki Luki down to Nevel, the Leningrad, Volkhov, and 2nd Baltic fronts have 11 armies facing off against Army Group North. From Nevel down to Mozir, it's the 15 armies of the 1st Baltic, Western, and Belarusian fronts against Army Group Center. And from Mozir down to the Black Sea are the 4 Ukrainian fronts and the Independent Coastal Army, poised to again attack Army Group South and A. Here's a few quoted words from John Erickson. The decisive year was almost over. In the East, Germany had neither won success nor achieved its nearest equivalent, a stalemate. In a future well within Stalin's immediate grasp, Soviet divisions would once more be on the 1941 frontier lines and in many places across them, thus enabling Stalin to promote his wildest strategic enterprises with none of that premature ambition he had displayed in the bitter spring of 1942. With his pocket full of plans, it was an opportunity to exploit to the full. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and health and happiness to everyone out there, wherever you are, from myself, Spartacus, Astrid, and the whole Time Goes team. For all that's been going on in our world in 2022, well, the past few years really, take a moment to spare some thoughts for those who've gone before, for those fighting here in 1943 in a world that had truly gone mad.
Sleep in heaven.